This is one of the most important new IEMs in a long time. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is the new CrinEar Meta, which is a new IEM from a new brand coming in at a price that I actually think is pretty aggressive given what we got here, 250 US bucks. Now the driver configuration, I can't tell you because I don't know, they're being a little cagey about it, but nonetheless, I think this is an important IEM for a couple of big reasons. Reason number one is the brand. This is CrinEar. This is a new brand from Crinacle. And if you're not familiar with Crinacle, well, you're probably not watching this video in the first place. He is an IEM reviewer, the most prominent IEM reviewer, the most influential headphone reviewer of all time, arguably. And he eventually graduated into doing tuning collaborations with other manufacturers and has been behind some of the best sounding IEMs on the market. And now here with CrinEar, he's got his own brand. And this is the first IEM in that brand. So I think that's pretty momentous. The other thing that's important here is that, well, it's in the name. This is Meta, which if you've been following this hobby for the past year or so, you've heard people like me talking about this new Meta tuning sound signature. It's basically, I don't know, the community is pushing for an alternative to the Harman target. And there have been a number of IEMs over the past year that have tried to do this new Meta tuning to varying degrees of success. I don't think any of them have perfectly nailed it, but has CrinEar's new Meta done it? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. Now, this is when I would normally say, shout out to hangout.audio for sending this IEM for review. If you want to check it out, I've got it linked in the description down below. And I will say that, and it is linked in the description down below. But by the time you're watching this video, there's a very good chance it's already sold out and you can't buy it anyway. They are making just 500 of these units. Well, they've said that they'll go up to 999 units, which I have a suspicion they will do. But that is, again, not a whole lot of units. And I, again, suspect that they are sold out by the time you're watching this video. So why am I reviewing in the first place? Good question. The other thing that I did want to take this moment to disclose is just that I'm friends with Crinacle. I've known Crinacle for a number of years. And I'm, of course, going to tell you that that doesn't influence my opinion, but that's up to you. You make up your own mind on that. What I will say in my defense is I've reviewed a number of his IEMs over the past few years, some of which I've loved and some of which I haven't. In fact, my most recent video is a little bit critical of one of his IEMs. So hopefully I've given you enough to trust me. But if you don't trust me, that's on you. But with that said, let's dive to the table and start talking about this IEM. Starting with the physical form factor, we'll talk about what comes inside the box, the build quality, fit and comfort, all that stuff. And then we'll get into talking about the sound on the Meta. We'll do a little bit of analysis on the frequency response, but mostly focus on my listening impressions. And also really focus on some comparisons with a number of other IEMs. In fact, I've got a lot of comparisons lined up. Some of these are frankly not going to be that fair given the price here, but we're nonetheless going to make them. But anyway, all right, I'm talking too much. Let's talk about the packaging, which is this very large box. In fact, I'm going to say this box is excessively large. It doesn't need to be this big. There is not that much in the box. I'm going to push that to the side. But here's what you get inside the box. You get these accessories, which is this little carry case. Okay, it's not a little carry case. It's actually a little bit on the chonky side. And frankly, I generally don't like big, bulky carry cases like this. But of course, I have my own problems. I have a lot of IEMs, so I need small, svelte carry cases. And if you're looking for a carry case that is protective and seemingly water resistant, if you're doing water sports with your IEMs, this will actually do a good job of protecting your IEMs, and it's nice that they include that. The other stuff that you get is pretty straightforward. You get two different sets of ear tips. I'm only highlighting two specific ear tips here, but you get small, medium, and large sets of each of these. So you get a silicone ear tip as well as a foam ear tip. The silicone ear tip is pretty similar to what we see with some Moondrop IEMs. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but it's pretty similar there. And then the foam tip is a pretty generic foam tip, which is mostly notable because it comes in multiple sizes. A lot of foam tips don't. Apart from that, well, we're just going to talk about the physical form factor and build quality on the IEM itself, starting with this cable and this little swappable termination mechanism. So it does have a swappable termination, which is pretty common these days. And I will say that I don't love the swappable termination here on this. I've seen this design on some other IEMs, and it's generally just not my favorite for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is it's a little bit on the long side. So, you know, I mean, the plus of having these swappable terminations is you can have a single-ended connector or a balanced connector depending on what you prefer. I like that because I like to have a single-ended connector, but a lot of people like these balanced connectors. So it's nice to have that option. I dig that. But The executions that do this without giving you a really long termination are the ones that I end up liking, whereas this one ends up being a little bit long side. So it just becomes a little bit cumbersome when it's coming out of the bottom of my digital audio player. Yeah, so that's a bit of a complaint. The other thing is the mechanism itself is, well, there's no retention here, right? So to swap terminations, you just pull on it, right? It's just held in there with friction, and then you align this and push on the alternative termination, and voila, you've got a balanced connector. But you can see that it's just held on with friction. There's no like locking mechanism, there's no screw or anything like that. And so because of that, okay, I haven't had this problem with this cable, so maybe I'm making much ado about nothing, but with other versions of this execution, I've had issues where I'll plug in, especially a 4.4 mil connector. These things can be a little bit on the tight side, and sometimes when I pull on it, this comes apart before this exits my digital audio player or whatever source I've got it connected to. So generally, I don't love that, but it is what it is, and it's not a big deal. Apart from that, the cable. All right, let's talk about this cable generally. I'm gonna make a little bit more room for myself. There's some good stuff and some bad stuff about this cable. The first stuff I actually want to say is just commend them on the color matching here. The aesthetic here with this IEM, going with a copper cable with black hardware and then a black IEM with copper highlights. I think that's actually a really, really nice look. Now, the complaints I'll have about this cable is that it can be a little bit on the kinky side, a little kink prone. As you can see by me just kind of balling it up into a fist, and it retains that position. Now, the plus side is that it works itself out pretty well, right? I just give it one of these little stretches, and generally you go back to a nice straight cable that generally has pretty nice behavior, right? You can see I'll roadie wrap it and give you the full shebang, but it's nice and soft, it's fairly supple, it's not overly stiff. It just is a little bit on the kinky side, which is mostly an issue when, frankly, I sleep. Like, I sleep with IEMs, and a lot of times I'll wake up with this IEM, and I have slept with it multiple times. Thank you very much. I'll wake up with this IEM, and the cable is just kind of wrinkly and messy, like a bed. So I have to wake up and stretch it out and smooth it out like I'm making my bed every morning. So I don't know, small complaint, I suppose. Otherwise, we have nice small Y-split hardware up here. We've got a chin slider that it's functional, but I do have to reposition it most of the times I fit this IEM because it doesn't stay in place super well. And then of course we've got our standard preformed ear hooks and 2-pin connectors. A couple notes on the 2-pin connectors just real quick. One is that the connection has a little bit of a protrusion, but the IEM itself, let me remove this, doesn't have a recess there. So there's, you know, a little bit of an excessive height here on the cable. The other thing is, you might have just noticed, this is actually a little bit of a stiff connection. It's a little hard to remove it, which is probably better than it being easy to remove, right? 2-pin connections can go loose over time, which can be a bigger problem, frankly. But just note that if you are swapping cables in this thing, be careful with it. It might be, I don't know, it's a little bit stiff, so you might cause problems. Be careful. Other than that, well, I don't think I'm talking about the cable anymore, so let's talk about these earpieces. And I guess I'll start with the aesthetics. I'll get that out of the way first. Aesthetically, I really like, again, the color motif here. The black colorway with the copper accents, I think is really pretty handsome. I love this chamfered edge on the outside, and the only thing I don't really like about the aesthetic on this IEM is the execution of the logos on them. It just looks pretty plain and kind of slapped on there. I'd love to see something a little bit more inventive, but, you know, it's not offensive. It's just also not particularly attractive. I don't know. I've never designed an IEM. Maybe I should try that one day. But nonetheless, I think this looks okay. Again, I like the colorway. But other than that, the shells have a lot of really positive qualities to them. In fact, they are a metal shell, which is unique amongst, you know, it's got the semi-custom molded design. And usually when you have this sort of a shape to an IEM, you've got a resin shell, like a plastic shell. But here, as you can probably hear, it is a fully metal shell. I assume it's an aluminum of some sort because while it does have some weight to it, it's not excessively heavy. It's still pretty lightweight, which is nice. But you do have that semi-custom molded design, which makes for pretty good fit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Other than that, I guess I'll comment here now just to say that this is a little bit on the small side. So I would describe the size as like a medium small, which is quite nice. The nozzle is in fact also a little bit on the small side. Let me pull out my calipers here to measure for you live and show you I'm not lying. 5.7 mil. Sometimes I get 5.8 mil. Yeah, it's about 5.8 millimeter width in diameter, which is not like super narrow, but it's narrow enough that I don't think most people are going to have an issue with the nozzle on this IEM. I think more likely some people might have an issue with the length on the nozzle, which is not especially long, but it is an IEM design that I think works better with a shorter ear tip. In fact, you might notice I'm not using the stock ear tips on here because for me, with the stock ear tips, it just didn't fit quite flush. And I'll demonstrate for you in a little bit what I mean. Instead, I'm wearing these AudioSense S400 ear tips, which just have the effect of shortening it a little bit. They also add a tilting functionality to it, which gives me a little bit more of a deeper, flusher fit. Apart from that, I don't know, not much to say except to throw these things into my ear. So I will do so. And as promised, there you go, a medium small shape. Doesn't take up a lot of space in the concha, like I don't feel pressure from it or anything like that. Generally, that is good. Fit stability is fantastic because it does have that molding in it that actually works quite well for my concha. Now, your mileage may vary. Everyone's ear shape is a little bit different, but I'll say that this one works quite well for me. And because it's medium small, I think it's probably going to work well for a lot of people, frankly. So yeah, comfort is good. Fit stability is good. And yeah, generally don't really have any complaints with the fit on this IEM. This is an IEM that I mentioned. I've slept with this IEM multiple times, and generally the sign of a good fitting IEM for me is like if I go to sleep with it and wake up with it and it's still in my ear, and that has happened with me with this IEM a couple of times so far, which is good. The one comment I did want to make, I was talking about the ear tip. So basically with a stock ear tip, it would fit a little bit more like this, which might not look that different. I'm probably even exaggerating a little bit. But the back of the IEM would fit flush against my concha bowl, but the front of the IEM wouldn't quite fit flush against my concha bowl. It would just kind of stick out just slightly. Whereas swapping to a shorter ear tip, and specifically this one that tilts a little bit, just lets me fit it in a little bit deeper, fits a little bit more flush. And I like that fit in terms of comfort more, but even more importantly, it does have some knock-on effects to the sound, which we'll talk about. Well, I guess next we can talk about the sound. Let me Rode wrap this thing back into a presentable shape, and we'll pull up the frequency response and do a bit of analysis on that together. Does that look handsome? Looks handsome. But let's go over here to our frequency response graph on SquigLink, which if you want to check this out for yourself, of course, I've got it on SquigLink linked in the description down below. You can pull up this graph, compare it with a bunch of other graphs, and get a good sense for what this thing sounds like. But let's do some analysis together. So this darker dotted line back here is my neutral target. This is what sounds neutral to me. And it happens to align pretty well with what people are calling this new meta sound signature, this tilted diffuse field, which is kind of aiming to go for just a neutral sound signature, right? It's not aiming to go for the most exciting sound signature. It's just, this is roughly what sounds neutral. And versus some other neutral targets, it's not like a clinical lean neutral. It's like a full-bodied, warm, relaxed, laid-back version of a neutral sound signature. And you can see that from, let's say, about 150 hertz north, the Project Meta pretty much aligns with that target. You know, there's a couple of deviations you might notice, like here in the upper mid-range, a little bit of a dip, and then in the treble, maybe some excessiveness, although I will say that generally frequency response graphs in the treble can be hard to read that deeply because of difficulties measuring treble, but, you know, maybe a little bit of deviation there, but mostly this is pretty in line with this neutral sound signature target. One obvious distinction or deviation is going to be here in the bass, where there is a very intentional bass boost, which is what you should probably expect from a Crinacle IEM. Crinacle likes his bass, and you do have a pretty significant bass boost that starts at, let's say, around 150, 100 hertz, and is mostly a sub-bass boost. Now, one thing I will comment on this before we get into more of my subjective analysis is that this is, yeah, okay, tuning wise, on paper wise, this is like a tilted diffuse field with a bass boost. To my ear, it does end up coming across a little bit more contrasty than what I've come to expect from this sound signature, which is to say that bass boost obviously is adding kind of one end of the contrast, and the other is the treble. It does end up sounding a little bit on the sparkly side. So while we have a tune that is going for a similar tune that we've seen in other IEMs, like the MegaFest and the KE4, I would say that this ends up sounding a little bit denser, a little bit more contrasty, maybe even a little bit on the V-shape side. And I guess that will lead us into talking more about my subjective listening impressions here of the Meta for that, I'm going to pull up my listening notes, make sure I don't miss anything. Let me start by just talking about the bass, which, you know, is the obvious, or the most obvious deviation from neutral that we see there in the frequency response. And I would say that for my personal taste, yes, I would say that the bass here is a little bit on the excessive side, but I think that it's actually better executed than the bass that we get on a lot of these other new meta sound signatures, right? The MegaFest and the KE4, the two examples that really come to mind. They've also got a pretty significant bass boost, and the way that the bass is executed on those ends up coming across a little bit on the bloomy side. Like, it's not super well defined, and I think the meta avoids that pretty much entirely for me. Like, it is a nice, well defined, like the attack on the bass is pretty sharp. And the bass boost is mostly sub-bass focused, which is also true of the others, but they nonetheless end up coming across a little bit low contrast and a little bit bloomy, whereas I really don't get any of that effect here with the meta. Now, I will say again, it does still sound a little bit sub-bass dominant for me. For my personal preferences, if I'm listening to Cigarettes After Sex, as I want to do, that music happens to have a lot of like pretty, maybe even excessive bass guitar in it. And on a set that has too much bass, it can kind of come across a little droning. I'll say in the meta, it's like on the edge. It's generally enjoyable, but it can come across a little bit too much to me. The good stuff though is that it does add a nice sense of texture, and it's well executed here, again, especially versus what we've seen on some of these other IEMs. Not necessarily stand out in terms of its definition, if we're comparing it to the best bass that I've ever heard, but I'll say it's better than the bass that I've heard on other similarly tuned IEMs. Again, nice sense of texture, nice sense of depth, and it contributes to this overall tonal balance that is a little bit more warm and a little bit more down tilted than you might expect from just a purely neutral sound signature. Now, on the treble, I'll say that this adds a little bit of a sparkliness to it, right? And frankly, for me, I actually had to dial it in a little bit with the tips. When I heard this thing first at CanJam about a month ago, in fact, I did a video where I talked about this a little bit, I actually found the treble on the meta to be just a little bit excessive. But it was within range where I figured if I did a little bit of tip rolling, I could dial it in and have it not be a problem. And I think that that is the case. So here with these AudioSense ear tips, they tend to have the effect of attenuating treble just slightly. And for me, this ends up being a nice benefit. Again, I think also having the IEM fit a little bit deeper in my ear is also contributing to that. But generally, I would say that it still nonetheless has a bit of a sparkliness to it, a little bit of an edge to it, without it really being sharp or sibilant, okay? So let me explain. Well, I don't know if I need to explain too much more than that. It's not sibilant. It doesn't come across as like peaky or like excessively bright in a sense, but it does nonetheless still have kind of a bit of a metallic edge to it that contributes to that contrastiness that I described. Again, to me, this new meta sound signature is a little bit on the low contrast generally, or like that's like if I use EQ to achieve this frequency response, to me it comes across a little bit on the low contrast. But here with the meta, given that bass boost plus this little bit of a upper treble zing to it, it gives it more of a contrasty sound signature that can come across a little bit on the edginess without necessarily the vocals being overly forward. In fact, if anything, I would say that the vocals on the meta come across a little bit on the relaxed side for my personal taste. I think if I'm just talking about my absolute favorite sound signatures, I like my vocals to be a little bit forward in the mix. I like them to have kind of like this easy room to breathe and like this openness. And the meta doesn't quite achieve that. I think that the timbre is frankly fantastic on the meta. The tuning does a really good job of making everything sound natural and transparent and clear. In fact, maybe even more so than like my ideal sound signature. So like it does that really well, but in terms of that openness and ease of vocal presentation, it's not quite what the meta does absolute best. Just generally, let me just say the timbre is fantastic. And I think that the imaging performance is actually quite nice. It's got a nice incisiveness to basically every part of the frequency response. So the definition between instruments is quite nice. The space between everything is good, although I would say that this thing indexes more in terms of like, at least in the way that I hear things, it indexes more in like in terms of depth, more so than width, right? So if you're, and that's kind of, for me, true of generally things that are bassier and warmer in their sound signatures, that I'll get like a nice sense of depth to it, but I won't necessarily get kind of like that width and that openness from the sound signature. And I think that's kind of how I would describe the spatial effects that I'm getting here out of the Meta. Again, the definition is quite good, so it's not for lack of that. It's just more because of that warm, downward tilting tonal balance to it. Okay, I don't think there's anything more I want to say about this thing without bringing some other IEMs in for comparison. So I just want to highlight for you all of the things that I want to compare with. And we're going to go through them. I don't know, we can go through them one by one. It's a lot of IEMs to talk about. Do I have more to talk about? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I have one more. There it is. That's right. I've got like 6 IEMs that I want to compare with this. And some of these are frankly not fair comparisons because price range wise, the Meta ends up being kind of in the middle of this bunch, but ends up being on the cheaper side. But nonetheless, let's start with these comparisons, and we'll start with, I guess, ascending levels of price. Not that price necessarily equates to sound quality, but here we go. So this is the EPZ P50. This is an IEM that came out pretty recently. I think the price is $210, although it fluctuates. And this is a sound signature that I think is also very similar to the Meta in a lot of ways. Like it's going for, well, it aligns very well with my neutral target with a bass boost, and it ends up sounding a little bit contrastier than what I expect, which is also true here of the Meta. Now, in terms of how they differentiate, I will say that the vocal on the P50 does end up coming across a little bit more forward, which you would think I would like. It also sounds a little bit less bassy, which again, you would think I would like. And it also has like kind of a similar level of contrastiness. What I think this thing loses in comparison to the Meta is it's just not quite as incisive, and I don't think the timbre is quite as transparent sounding as the Meta. So between these two, I don't know, I end up actually just generally preferring the Meta overall. Kind of strictly better. Again, I do like the slightly more vocal forwardness of this, but it doesn't really achieve that, again, kind of like open breathiness that I like to my vocal presentation. So it doesn't quite get there, and because of that, yeah, I don't know. I would say that the Meta wins out in that comparison. I don't know if I should be ranking these right now yet, but I'm nonetheless doing it. We're doing it. This here is the Kiwi Ears KE4. Which is another, I think, $200 IEM. And I've mentioned this one a couple of times at this point because frequency response wise, this very much aligns with the new Meta frequency response. And frankly, if you look at it versus the Meta, they look almost the same. In listening impressions, there are, however, some notable differences. Difference number one is just that this is going to, well, okay, let me actually say where they're really similar is that they have kind of a similarly warm, somewhat darkened the vocal presentation. Overall, I will say that the KE4 is the bassier set of the bunch, and I don't think it's better for that. I think that the bass here on the KE4 is a little bit softer in its attack, a little bit bloomier, and a little bit more intruding on the rest of the sound signature. It's not as incisive and tight and punchy. It's not bad. It's definitely a very, very good IEM. But nonetheless, versus the Meta in comparison, the bass is just much better executed. And you have a very similar sound signature that I think the Meta just frankly does it better. Is there anywhere I would say that the KE4 is better? It's maybe a little bit softer. It lacks a little bit of that edginess to it. So maybe it can sound a little bit more relaxed because of that. And you might prefer the KE4, but overall, I'm gonna give this one again to the Meta. Next up, another IEM. This one's actually not going for the new Meta sound signature. In fact, this sound signature here, this is the AFU Performer P5+2 or the P7, depending on whether or not you know how to do math. And this one is $240. And this one's actually, you could probably describe as like kind of more old Meta in terms of its tuning philosophy. It's got more of that leaner, contrastier sound. It's got less mid-bass, a thinner lower mid-range presentation, but that ends up giving it like this contrastiness, and it's got a little bit more vocal presence that gives it some of that open vocal presentation that I like. I would say that also in terms of spatial effects, again, I mentioned that the Meta is not like an especially wide sounding IEM. I do think that the P7 does present a little bit on the wider side. And it's got kind of a similar quality to the bass, although I would say that overall it's probably less intrusive when it comes to like the sub-bass frequencies. So there's some things about the P5 or the P5+2 or P7 that I do actually like better than the Meta, but overall I still nonetheless lean toward the Meta because I think that the timbre, the vocal, the transparency, and that vocal clarity is just, it comes across just so good. Like I think we're onto something with this tilted diffuse field sound signature. I think it's worth continuing down this road. And when you're listening to these two IEMs in comparison, like you get this, again, there's some maybe bigger differences in terms of the timbre that are going to stand out to you initially, which is a brighter, livelier sound versus a warmer, denser sound. But really, when you pay attention to the instruments and how natural and organic they sound, I think that this tuning is achieving that in a way that this older style of tuning isn't. And for that reason, again, I'm gonna pick the Meta. But now we're getting into some IEMs that, again, these might not be the fairest of comparisons because, well, price-wise, these are all going to be more expensive than the Meta. But again, price isn't everything, and this is the Soft Ears Volume S. This is a pretty new IEM that's come out recently. Price is $320 US bucks, so a good $70 or maybe, well, I don't know, it's like a third more expensive than the Meta. But it has kind of like a similar tuning philosophy, but also it's got a bit of its own thing going on. I will say that what I like about the Volume S, like what really stands out to me about and why I gave this one a 5-star review, is a couple of things. One, the bass physicality is to die for. I love the bass physicality on this. It's maybe a little bit excessive in its bass. It's a little bit more mid-bassy versus something like the Meta, which ends up being more sub-bass focused. But the benefit is that you get this really nice sense of attack on things like kick drums. You get this nice physicality behind them. And it's frankly a lot of fun. And it doesn't have some of that sub-bass drone that you can sometimes get here on the Meta, depending on the music you're listening to. So I actually kind of like that. And then I also think that the vocals are quite a bit more forward here on the Volume S. Some people might call it shouty. And personally, I'm just going to say it sounds good. I like that, again, kind of a breathiness, a slightly lower contrastness to the vocal presentation that just gives it like this open, textured, I don't know what to say apart from just lovely sound and repro on the vocal that the Volume S does really, really well. And I think the Meta does like a good job with the timbre, and vocals sound correct, but they don't have that character to it that I like. And so I think overall, I actually am going to lean more toward the Volume S. Now again, there is a price differential here, but nonetheless, I'm going to lean toward this. Another one I wanted to pull in is the High Senior Megafest. And this one's super unfair because this one costs literally twice what the Meta costs at $590. It's actually more than twice. But nonetheless, this is kind of like the godfather of this tuning, this tilted diffuse field sound signature. Even if that wasn't what they're going for, they nailed it. And well, there's actually some notable differences here. Now, I've already kind of mentioned that the bass on the Meta is actually much better executed. Like here on the Megafest, the bass it comes across a little bit bloomy, a little bit soft in its attack, and I don't know, there's a bass emphasis here that frankly it feels like it doesn't need. Whereas the bass emphasis here in the Meta, maybe it's a little bit more than what I would prefer in my absolute ideal sound signature. It sounds intentional and it sounds better executed, right? If you're looking for a bass boost, you're going to prefer the bass on the Meta, I think. However, the mid-range tonality actually ends up coming across quite a bit different. Some of that like low contrast, warm, neutral sound signature that I was describing of what I generally expect of this tilted diffuse field sound signature, that's actually what we get here with the Megafest. Whereas here with the Meta, again, I'm hearing something that sounds a little bit contrastier, a little bit denser, and a little bit warmer. Whereas the Megafest ends up sounding to me a little bit more vocal forward, a little bit more open, a little bit more easy and low contrast. And that, because of that, ends up being, I think, the IEM, the sound that I tend to gravitate toward. I also think that the treble is a little bit less incisive on the Megafest versus the Meta. And for me, that I would say is probably on a plus. Like I would say that's a plus in this side because it's not like it's a soft, blunted treble attack. Like the definition on instruments is generally quite good here in the Megafest, even if the bass is maybe a little bit of an intrusion. But it doesn't have some of that metallic edge to it. Again, it just comes across a little bit more organic sounding, while still retaining a lot of those timbre and tonal benefits of this new Meta tuning. So overall, I do prefer the Megafest, but if you're after, like, if you've heard the Megafest and you're like, oh, I like the tonality, but the bass kind of sucks, I kind of agree. And the Meta, frankly, solves that aspect of it, and it does it at half the price. So there's that. And now the final IEM I'm going to bring in for comparison, because I gotta, again, another unfair comparison on price, because this is the Moondrop Cross Crinacle Dusk. This is 300 and might almost be 400 bucks at this point because the prices went up, but it's 360 bucks when I reviewed it. And this IEM, I gave my Earphone of the Year award last year. So basically this was my favorite IEM that came out in 2024. And it's also from Crinacle, which is interesting. And this is why I have to compare it, right? The other thing is that this IEM comes with a DSP cable that will by default give you a tuning, a sound signature. Is actually very similar to what the Meta is going after. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but mostly I listen to this IEM without that cable. I just listen to it as an analog IEM without the DSP because I just prefer not to use analog, or I prefer not to use digital USB cables. That's basically it. But so in terms of how these things compare cable to cable, analog to analog, the Dusk in analog form is just overall a brighter, lighter, more vocal forward sound. It is definitely thinner in its body, and that aspect of the Meta I generally prefer. But the vocal resolution here on the Dusk is just, it's awesome. This is doing everything that I like. I was talking about the openness of vocals and like just being a little bit on the forward side and having kind of like this room to breathe. You get all of that texture and micro contrast out of the vocal. I really think that the Dusk is quite a few steps ahead in terms of that. I don't think it's necessarily because of like driver configuration or anything like that. I think it's just really the tonal balance, whereas the vocals on the Meta end up being a little bit on the relaxed side, a little bit pulled back, and that bass ends up becoming a little bit more dominant, whereas you still get quite a bit of sub bass emphasis here on the Dusk, but the tuning, especially on the analog, just ends up being less intrusive. It's maybe even more sub bass dominant, but interestingly, I think the physicality on the bass is still kind of a step ahead here on the Dusk. Like this is, to me, standout bass quality, whereas this is good bass quality on the Meta, even if it's not quite standout, if that distinction makes any difference or any sense to you. I think also in terms of like spatial effects, the Dusk is going to sound more wide and more open, whereas the Meta is going to sound more deep, more front to back depth, whereas less of that left to right lateral openness. Again, this is how I interpret this stuff in my head. And yeah, overall, I do end up still preferring the Dusk, even though without the analog cable, it really doesn't hit this tilted diffuse field sound signature, which is frankly more like my target, but the Meta does a better job of that. But nonetheless, I think I do end up preferring this. Now, with the DSP cable, this does get very, very close to a similar sound signature to this. But nonetheless, I actually still think sounds quite different. This is interesting, all right? Seeing all these IEMs that are going for a very similar sound signature, you can see their frequency responses, you can see where they align most of the time. And in fact, these two align most of the time when you look at the graphs. But nonetheless, to my ear, this ends up sounding more like that kind of low contrast, warm, full, laid back, but still like bright and open. I feel like I just used every word in the book and maybe made no sense, but this to me sounds like what I'm expecting from the tilted diffuse field neutral sound signature. Whereas again, the Meta ends up coming across slightly on the V-shaped sound side, slightly on the contrasty side. And because of that, with the DSP, I also still prefer the sound that we get here on the Dusk. It's maybe a little bit less incisive. Some people might end up preferring the pluckiness that you get here on the Meta. And that pluckiness, maybe, I don't know if you've heard something like the Hyphen Edition XS as an example. Like I think the Meta does that in a way that this is a little bit softer in its treble. But overall, just I can't get away from my preference for the vocal presentation. So I will still pick that. Now, just for scoreboard wise, that's basically like 3 IEMs that I liked better than the Meta and 3 IEMs that I didn't like as much. And they do all happen to come down to price. Basically, amongst all these IEMs that are priced more similarly, for me, the Meta wins. And I guess that's going to lead us into my conclusion here on this IEM. Let me just pull up my notes, make sure I haven't missed anything. I don't think I have. All right, out of 5 stars, I got to rate this thing. I'm going to give the CrinEar Project Meta a very solid 4 stars out of 5. I think, again, I've been kind of unfair in some of these comparisons, right? I'm comparing this with IEMs that cost double its price. And maybe I shouldn't be, but it's hard not to, given that this is from Crinacle and given the sound signature that's going for. So I'm making those comparisons. I think versus similarly priced IEMs, this is probably, I don't know, if I'm spending $250, this is probably the IEM that I'm going to be buying. But if I'm going for this particular sound signature, I probably still would gravitate towards some others. I'll leave that up to you to decide, but hopefully you've got some sense of my opinion here on the CrinEar Metta. A very nice IEM, a little bit on the contrasty side, and frankly, I'm excited. I hope this is a sign of things to come from CrinEar. And well, like I mentioned, you can check the description down below for a link, but it's probably sold out. Check it out anyway. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, think about hitting the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.